Peter Daniels shuffled his mop bucket forward, the wheels squeaking on the linoleum in a rhythm that seemed to echo his growing unease. It was his first shift as a janitor at Tremaine Logistics, and the night felt like it might stretch on forever. The building had that peculiar emptiness that all offices acquire after hours. A hollow shell that seemed to amplify every small sound until it became something else entirely. The smell of industrial cleaning supplies couldn't quite mask the lingering sense of day-old coffee and printer toner that permeated the building. Peter's uniform, still stiff from being new, rustled with each movement as he made his way down the corridor. The fabric felt rough against his skin, like it belonged to someone else. He glanced at the logbook clipped to his cart, its plastic cover worn smooth by countless hands before his. Flipping through the previous entries, he noticed how the handwriting styles changed. Some neat and precise, others hurried and barely legible. Most were unremarkable. Notes on cleaning supplies running low, maintenance issues that needed attention, or complaints about overflowing trash bins. But as he reached the end of the page, a handwritten note stood out in red ink, the color so vivid it seemed to pulse against the pale paper. If you hear the clock chime, leave immediately. Don't check it. Don't wait. Peter furrowed his brow, his fingers lingering on the page's edge. The paper felt unusually cold beneath his touch. He flipped to the next page, but the note stood alone, surrounded by mundane entries about broken light fixtures and carpet stains. Was it a joke? Some hazing ritual for the new guy? The thought didn't comfort him as much as he hoped it would. The hallway seemed to grow colder as he stood there, his mop handle damp in his palm, the moisture seeping into his skin like ice water. The cleaning cart's metal frame reflected the fluorescent light in strange ways, creating distorted patterns on the walls. He brushed it off, forcing himself to take steady breaths. First shifts were always nerve-wracking, he told himself, and whoever wrote the note had probably just been messing around. Still, something about those red letters nagged at him, like a splinter in his mind he couldn't quite reach. He returned to his work, maneuvering his cart into the break room to clean the counters and sweep the floor. A wall-mounted clock ticked steadily above the fridge, its plain face somehow more ominous than it should have been in the half-light. He checked his watch. 12:14 a.m. 2 hours down, 6 to go. The digital display seemed too bright in the dim room, the numbers burning themselves into his vision when he looked away. The night dragged on with little to break the monotony, but each passing minute seemed to add weight to the air around him. By the time he finished cleaning the first floor, his back ached, and his legs felt stiff, as if he'd been walking for days instead of hours. The cleaning cart's wheels left faint tracks in the dust, tracks that seemed to fade more quickly than they should have. He decided to take a short break in the security office, where he found an ancient coffee machine still half filled with a brew that looked more like sludge. The machine itself hummed with an electrical undertone that seemed to vibrate at an uncomfortable frequency, just at the edge of hearing. The coffee smelled burnt and metallic, but he needed something to keep him alert. As he sipped the bitter liquid, trying not to think about how long it had been sitting there, he leaned back in the swivel chair, scanning the security monitors. The building was quiet, the screens showing empty hallways and offices bathed in various shades of gray. The monitor's soft electronic hum mixed with the coffee machine's drone, creating a discordant symphony that set his teeth on edge. At exactly 1:33 a.m., something caught his eye. On the second-floor feed, the image blurred briefly before refocusing, the static crawling across the screen like insects. A shadow moved at the edge of the frame, quick and deliberate, slipping into one of the office cubicles. Peter leaned closer, squinting at the screen, his coffee forgotten. The shadow seemed too solid, too purposeful to be a trick of the light. Probably a glitch, he muttered, his words falling flat in the small room. But even as he said it, he noticed how the air pressure had changed, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then the chime rang. It was faint at first, almost like a distant bell carried on the wind, but it held a quality that made his bones vibrate. The sound cut through the building, soft yet somehow overwhelming in its clarity, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Peter froze, his mind snapping back to the logbook's note, the red ink seeming to flash behind his eyes. If you hear the clock chime, leave immediately. Don't check it. Don't wait. He shook his head, trying to clear it. That was nonsense. He hadn't seen a clock in the building large enough to make a sound like that. Besides, what harm could come from looking? The rational part of his mind insisted that there must be a logical explanation, even as his instincts screamed at him to run. Grabbing his flashlight, its familiar weight providing little comfort, Peter stepped out of the security office and climbed the stairwell to the second floor. The emergency lights cast a sickly glow that seemed to pulse slightly, like a dying heartbeat. The hallways were bathed in this faint illumination, casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to reach for him as he passed. He followed the faint echo of the chime, which seemed to linger in the air even though it had stopped, like smoke that refuses to dissipate. As he passed the rows of cubicles, his footsteps sounded impossibly loud, each one echoing back at him a fraction of a second too late. The office supplies scattered across desks, paper clips, staplers, family photos and cheap frames, all seemed frozen in time, covered in a thin layer of dust that shouldn't have accumulated overnight. Every now and then, the faint sound of ticking broke the silence, though he couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to move around him, always just out of sight. And then he saw it. A grandfather clock stood at the end of the hallway, its dark wood polished to an impossible sheen that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its brass pendulum swung in perfect rhythm, each movement accompanied by a soft whoosh that sounded almost like breathing. The clock's face was marked by ornate Roman numerals that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from the corner of his eye. Peter's heart skipped a beat, then began racing. That hadn't been there before. He was sure of it. He'd walked this hallway earlier, and there had been nothing but a blank wall and a water cooler. The clock struck again. The chime echoed, reverberating through the empty office with a sound that seemed to carry centuries of weight. Peter's hand tightened around the flashlight until his knuckles turned white. He glanced behind him, his gut instinct screaming to leave, but his curiosity rooted him in place. The beam of his flashlight seemed dimmer now, as if the darkness were becoming more solid, more resistant to illumination. Suddenly, the world seemed off-kilter, like a painting hung slightly askew. The hallway was just a little too long, the air a little too heavy, as if reality itself were stretching like taffy. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, though they had been steady moments ago, creating a strobing effect that made the shadows dance and writhe. Peter's phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration feeling alien and wrong in this distorted space. He fumbled for it, relieved for the distraction from the increasingly surreal scene before him. The screen's blue light felt harsh and artificial. It was a text from his sister. "Where are you?" Peter frowned, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The question seemed loaded with meaning he couldn't quite grasp. He texted back quickly, "At work." "Why?" The response came almost instantly, the words appearing before he could even lower his hand. "What work?" "You quit Tremaine 2 months ago." His stomach dropped, a cold void opening up inside him. That's not right, he thought. his fingers shaking as they typed back, "No, I just started tonight." The keys seemed to shift under his touch, making it difficult to type accurately. The reply came faster than he expected. Impossibly fast. "Peter, you haven't been yourself. Please come home." Before he could process the message, before he could make sense of the wrongness that seemed to be seeping into every corner of his reality, the clock chimed again. The sound was different this time, deeper, more resonant, as if it were chiming from the bottom of an endless well. Peter spun around, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. The hallway behind him was empty, but something was terribly wrong. His footsteps had disappeared from the dusty floor, leaving it pristine and untouched. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't leaving marks. His body no longer seemed to interact with his surroundings, as if he were becoming less real with each passing moment. His heart raced as he stumbled back toward the stairwell, the sound of his pulse drowning out everything else. He needed air, needed to escape this oppressive space that seemed to be closing in around him. But as he opened the door to the stairs, he found himself back on the same floor, facing the same hallway. The clock stood at the end, waiting, its pendulum swinging in eerie silence. The brass fittings gleamed with a light that came from nowhere. He turned and ran toward the nearest office, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The rows of cubicles blurred past him, their walls seeming to shift and change as he passed. He burst into a manager's office and slammed the door shut, the sound oddly muffled. Breathing heavily, he sank into the chair and tried to gather his thoughts, but they slipped away like water through his fingers. That's when he noticed the desk calendar. It was dated June 2nd, 2019, over 2 years earlier. His mouth went dry as he realized the computer screen displayed the same date, its soft glow pulsing in time with the distant ticking. His phone, now silent in his pocket, had vanished completely, leaving not even an impression in the fabric. The clock chimed again, the sound somehow inside his head now, reverberating through his skull. Peter knew he couldn't stay there. The only way to escape was to confront the impossible. He stormed out of the office, the fluorescent lights overhead now flickering violently, casting strange shadows that seemed to follow his movements. He marched toward the grandfather clock, each step feeling heavier than the last. "You don't belong here," he shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty halls, coming back to him distorted and wrong. The clock's pendulum slowed, almost as if acknowledging him, its brass surface reflecting a face that wasn't quite his own. The air grew colder with each step, frost beginning to form on the nearby windows, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like faces. Peter could swear he heard whispers, faint but persistent, speaking words in languages that had never existed. The logbook's warning screamed in his mind, but he pressed on until he was standing directly in front of the clock. Its brass hands were stuck at 1:33 a.m. and had perhaps always been stuck there, in this moment, waiting for him. He reached out to touch the pendulum, and the world spun violently, reality fracturing around him like a broken mirror. The world around him shattered like glass, each shard reflecting a different moment in time, leaving him standing in a stark white void that seemed to go on forever. Ahead of him was a figure, a man wearing a janitor's uniform identical to his own, down to the name tag that read Peter Daniels. The man's eyes were wide and terrified, reflecting an endless succession of nights spent in this timeless space. "You're the next one," the figure said, its voice carrying the weight of countless repeated warnings. "This place doesn't let anyone leave. It never has. It never will." Before Peter could respond, Before he could ask any of the questions burning in his mind, the clock chimed one last time. The sound was final, definitive, like a judge's gavel falling. Months later, the new janitor started their first night at Tremaine Logistics. They found the logbook clipped to their cart, its pages filled with the mundane details of office maintenance. But there, on the last page, a new entry waited in fresh red ink that seemed to gleam wetly in the fluorescent light. If you hear the clock chime, leave immediately. Don't check it. Don't wait. They say the building is still there, its windows dark after hours, the floors silent except for the sound of wheels squeaking on linoleum and the occasional distant chime of a clock that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, if you look carefully through the second-floor windows at exactly 1:33 a.m., you might catch a glimpse of a figure in a janitor's uniform, eternally mopping floors that never get dirty, trapped in a moment that never ends. The mall was quiet, too quiet. Danny Velasquez strolled down the dimly lit corridors of Midtown Plaza, his flashlight beam bouncing off shuttered storefronts like a lonely spotlight searching for an audience. The hollow echo of his footsteps reverberated through the empty space, each step a reminder of his solitude. It was a dead-end job, but the overnight security gig paid the bills. Most nights were uneventful, marked only by the steady tick of his watch and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He'd walk the halls, check the locks, and do his best to fight off the creeping boredom that threatened to overwhelm him during the long hours between midnight and dawn. But tonight felt different. The air hung heavy with an inexplicable tension, like the atmosphere before a storm. The familiar corridors seemed somehow altered, as if the mall had shifted slightly while no one was looking. Danny had worked here for 8 months, but tonight, the shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. Danny reached the food court, a cavernous space filled with empty chairs and tables arranged in neat rows like forgotten sentinels. The fountain in the center gurgled softly, the trickling water echoing off the high ceiling, the only sound besides his footsteps. The neon signs of closed restaurants cast strange, colorful reflections on the polished floor, creating abstract patterns that danced at the edge of his vision. He glanced at his watch. 2:15 a.m. Halfway through his shift. The face of his watch caught the dim light, its hands moving with agonizing slowness. With a yawn that seemed too loud in the emptiness, he turned toward the security office for his scheduled check-in. The security office was a cramped room tucked away in a forgotten corner of the mall, its walls lined with aging equipment that hummed continuously. The monitors greeted him with a wall of grainy black and white footage, the blue-tinted glow casting strange shadows across his face. Cameras dotted the mall's interior, displaying every corner of the building in a patchwork of surveillance feeds. Danny leaned back in the squeaky chair, a familiar companion that protested every movement, and sipped lukewarm coffee from his thermos. The bitter taste lingered on his tongue as he scanned the screens methodically, his eyes moving from one to the next with practiced efficiency. Rows of empty shops, quiet hallways, nothing out of the ordinary. Then something moved. It was subtle, a flicker on the feed from the third-floor corridor, like a piece of static come to life. Danny leaned forward, the chair's protests forgotten as he squinted at the screen. A shadow darted across the frame, quick and deliberate, its movements too smooth to be natural. It disappeared into one of the shuttered stores, leaving behind a momentary distortion in the video feed, like a ripple in still water. His pulse quickened, the sudden surge of adrenaline cutting through the midnight drowsiness. Trespassers were rare, but not unheard of. Teenagers liked to sneak in, daring each other to explore the mall's eerily deserted halls, their nervous laughter echoing through the empty spaces. Danny had caught his fair share of them, usually huddled in dark corners with spray cans or cigarettes. He grabbed his flashlight and his radio, the familiar weight of both offering little comfort, as he muttered to himself, "Just kids messing around." The words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. When he reached the third floor, the hallway was still, suspended in an unnatural quiet that seemed to swallow even the sound of his breathing. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering in uneven intervals that created a strobing effect, making the shadows appear to writhe and twist. The air felt thick, almost resistant, as if he were moving through invisible cobwebs. He moved cautiously toward the shop where he'd seen the figure, his shoes squeaking against the freshly waxed floor. The store was locked, the metal gate pulled down securely, its latticed pattern casting crisscrossing shadows that reminded Danny of prison bars. His brow furrowed as he examined the gate, looking for any sign of tampering. The lock was intact, showing no evidence of forced entry. He glanced around, shining his flashlight into every corner, but the hall remained empty, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the walls and returning to him distorted, almost unrecognizable. "Mall security. If anyone's here, you need to leave." Silence answered him, but it wasn't the ordinary silence of an empty building. This silence felt alive, attentive, as if it were listening to him. He checked the gate's lock again, giving it a firm tug for good measure. It didn't budge, the metal cold and unyielding beneath his fingers. With a sigh that didn't quite mask his unease, he keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Danny. I thought I saw movement near the third floor corridor, but everything looks secure. Might have been a glitch on the cameras." The response crackled in his ear, the familiar voice of the dispatch operator distorted by static. "Copy that, Danny. Keep us posted." As he walked away, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sensation crawled up his spine like ice water, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Every few steps he found himself glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see something, someone, standing in the shadows. But the hallway remained empty, the silence broken only by the steady rhythm of his footsteps and the irregular buzz of failing fluorescent tubes. The next hour passed uneventfully, but the unease lingered, a constant presence at the edge of his consciousness. Back in the security office, Danny replayed the footage from earlier, leaning close to the monitor as he watched the scene unfold again. He paused the recording at the exact moment the shadow appeared, studying the grainy image with growing concern. It was indistinct, humanoid, but featureless, and it moved with unsettling speed, its edges seeming to blur into the darkness around it. He checked the live feeds again, his eyes scanning the monitors with renewed intensity. The cameras covering the food court showed empty tables bathed in dim emergency lighting. The second floor appeared normal, the closed shops standing silent behind their metal gates. The parking garage cameras displayed rows of empty spaces, the concrete pillars casting long shadows in the artificial light. Then, on the third floor feed, the shadow reappeared. It stood still this time, just outside the store he'd checked earlier, a dark silhouette against the flickering lights. Danny's throat tightened as he leaned closer to the screen, his coffee forgotten on the desk beside him. The figure seemed to flicker, as though caught between frames of the video feed, its outline pulsing slightly with each flicker of the lights. Its head tilted unnaturally, turning at an impossible angle, as if it knew Danny was watching, as if it wanted him to see it. The screen went black. Danny's heart leapt into his throat, his fingers instinctively gripping the edge of the desk. He banged the side of the monitor with growing desperation, but the feed wouldn't return. The screen remained stubbornly dark, reflecting his own pale face back at him. He switched to another camera, then another, but the third-floor feed remained blank, a dark window into nothing. Grabbing his flashlight and a spare set of keys that jangled too loudly in the quiet, Danny headed back to the third floor. This time, the silence felt suffocating, pressing against his ears like cotton wool. His footsteps echoed sharply against the tiled floors, each sound seeming to announce his presence to whatever might be waiting in the darkness. As he approached the corridor, he noticed a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal, the sound raising goosebumps on his arms. The store gate was no longer closed. It hung slightly ajar, its lock dangling uselessly like a broken promise. The sight made Danny's stomach churn, acid rising in his throat. He shone his flashlight into the store, the beam cutting through years of accumulated dust that danced in the air like silent snow. The scraping sound grew louder, coming from somewhere deep inside the store, a rhythmic sound that seemed to mock the beating of his heart. "Whoever's in here, come out now," Danny shouted, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear that threatened to close his throat. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to ring in his ears. Danny took a step inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom like a searchlight. He moved cautiously between rows of shelves covered in thick dust, the beam revealing forgotten merchandise still arranged as if waiting for customers who would never come. The air inside the store was stale, heavy with the smell of damp cardboard and mildew, an organic decay that seemed out of place in the sterile mall environment. Toward the back of the room, he found a trail of footprints in the dust. Bare footprints that seemed to appear from nowhere, as if their owner had materialized in the middle of the store. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, the words barely audible even to himself. "Why's it always gotta be the weird ones?" The footprints led to a storage door at the back of the shop, each print perfectly formed in the dust, showing no sign of hesitation or altered gait. Danny hesitated, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand, casting wobbling shadows on the walls. He pushed the door open, the hinges protesting with a long, low creak that seemed to go on forever. The small storage room was empty, save for a single security camera mounted high on the wall, its presence an unexpected surprise in this forgotten space. Its lens pointed directly at the door, its tiny red light blinking steadily like a mechanical eye. Danny stepped inside, his nerves stretched to breaking point. The air was cold, far colder than it should have been, his breath forming small clouds in front of his face. He turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of the intruder, but the beam of his flashlight revealed only bare walls and empty shelves. The door slammed shut behind him with a force that made the walls shake. Danny whirled around, his flashlight illuminating nothing but the blank door, its surface somehow different than it had been moments before. He grabbed the handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge, the metal ice cold against his palm. He fumbled for his radio, his fingers clumsy with fear, his voice tight with panic. "Dispatch, this is Danny. I'm stuck in the third-floor storage room. The door's jammed. Send backup." The response was garbled, distorted by static that seemed to form words of its own. Danny, not alone. "What? Repeat that," Danny shouted, his voice bouncing off the walls in a cacophony of echoes. The radio crackled again, the static rising to a painful screech before falling silent. Then, from somewhere behind him, he heard a faint whisper, the sound seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Leave." Danny turned sharply, his flashlight sweeping the room in wild arcs. The light fell on the security camera, which was now hanging loosely from its mount. Wires sparking faintly in the darkness like dying fireflies. The whisper came again, louder this time, the word forming in the air like frost. Leave. The door creaked open slowly, as if inviting him to go, the hinges groaning in a way that sounded almost like laughter. Danny didn't hesitate. He bolted out of the room, back into the store, and down the corridor to the stairwell, his footsteps thundering in the enclosed space. He didn't stop running until he reached the security office, his lungs burning and his heart threatening to burst from his chest. The monitors were flickering when he arrived, static crackling across the screens like angry insects. The third-floor feed briefly came into focus, the image sharp and clear despite the earlier malfunction. The shadow stood in the middle of the corridor, perfectly still, staring directly into the camera. Its form seemed more solid now, more real, though still without features or definition. It was a hole in reality, a piece of darkness given form. Danny backed away from the monitors, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He grabbed his phone, ready to call the police, but the screen showed no signal. The familiar bars replaced by an empty void. He looked back at the monitors, dreading what he might see. The shadow was gone, but something had changed. The cameras showed the mall as they always had, but it seemed different now, as if he were seeing it through a dark filter. The familiar corridors and shops looked wrong somehow, twisted into something that only pretended to be normal. Danny spent the rest of the shift holed up in the security office, his eyes darting to every corner of the room, starting at every sound. The monitors remained quiet, showing only empty halls and closed shops, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him through the screens, waiting. When dawn finally broke, sending pale fingers of light through the mall's skylights, he left without a word to anyone, his steps quick and uncertain. The next night, Danny called in sick, his voice shaking as he made the call. He never went back to Midtown Plaza, choosing instead to find work across town, as far from the mall as he could get. Weeks later, the new night guard found a note scrawled on a piece of paper in the security office, the handwriting frantic and uneven. Don't follow it. The note was filed away and forgotten. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the mall is at its emptiest, the security cameras still catch glimpses of something moving through the halls, a shadow that stands too still, watching, waiting for someone else to notice it. The studio lights were dim, casting sickly yellow pools across the aging equipment, the air heavy with the familiar cocktail of stale coffee and the ozone smell of old electronics. Natalie Cole settled into her worn swivel chair, wincing at the familiar squeak of protesting springs, and adjusted her microphone with practiced precision. The clock on the wall read 11:58 p.m., almost time for her shift. Midnight to 6 a.m. was a quiet shift at Crid 104.7, the small-town station known for its endless loop of classic rock and late-night call-ins. The graveyard shift that most DJs dreaded, but one she'd grown to cherish over the past 3 years. The building itself seemed to breathe around her, its ancient ventilation system wheezing through ducts that had seen decades of service. Outside, beyond the studio's soundproofed walls, the small town of Ridgeway slept, unaware of the solitary figure keeping watch over their midnight hours. Natalie enjoyed the solitude, found comfort in it even. The steady rhythm of music and the occasional call from a trucker or insomniac kept her grounded in ways her daylight hours never could. There was something intimate about being the voice in someone's darkest hours, a companion to the sleepless and the wandering. Tonight she'd prepared her usual lineup, hits from Led Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac, and Pink Floyd, the classics that seemed to resonate most deeply in those hollow hours between midnight and dawn. She adjusted the levels on the soundboard, muscle memory guiding her fingers across the switches and dials she knew by heart. The equipment was old, ancient by modern standards, but it had character, personality. Every button had its own quirk, every dial its sweet spot. She flipped the main switch, leaning toward the mic as the on-air light flickered to life above her head. "And you're tuned into CRID 104.7, the voice of late-night freedom," she spoke, her voice dropping into the smooth, professional tone she'd perfected over countless broadcasts. "Up next, we've got a classic from the Eagles, but first, let's hear from our listeners. Got a story to share? A song request? Call in and join me in the midnight hour." She punched the play button, and the opening notes of Hotel California filled the studio, Don Henley's voice weaving through the darkness like an old friend. Stretching her arms above her head, she yawned and stared at the control panel's blinking lights, a constellation of red and green that had become as familiar as stars. Nothing unusual. The hum of the old equipment and the faint rhythm of the music were her only companions, just the way she liked it. The first hour passed without incident, the night settling into its familiar routine. Natalie fielded a call from a lonely trucker somewhere on Interstate 80, his voice gravelly with fatigue as he requested a Bob Seger song. She obliged, sipping her coffee, black, 2 sugars, while Turn the Page played through the monitors. The trucker's story about his long haul from Chicago had been typical, comforting in its mundanity. Everything felt routine, normal, safe, until the static started. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, a soft hiss under the music like distant rain on a tin roof. She adjusted the knobs with familiar expertise, thinking it was just interference from the ancient soundboard. The equipment had its moods, its bad days, but this felt different. The static persisted, growing louder with each passing second until it began to drown out the song entirely, like waves slowly rising over a drowning victim. "Damn it," Natalie muttered, grabbing her headphones and sliding them over her ears. The static was clearer now, almost rhythmic in its fluctuations. She flipped through the controls methodically, searching for the source of the interference, her frustration mounting as each adjustment failed to solve the problem. The music cut out completely, replaced by a silence so absolute it seemed to press against her eardrums. Then a voice emerged from the static, like a hand reaching through fog. "Hello?" Natalie froze, her fingers hovering over the controls. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something wrong about it. Something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She glanced at the phone console, but all the lines were dark, dead. No incoming calls, no blinking lights. Nothing to explain the voice now whispering in her ears. "Hello?" the voice said again, louder this time, more insistent. There was an edge to it now, a desperation that made Natalie's skin crawl. She hesitated, her professional training warring with her instincts. Finally, she responded, keeping her voice steady despite the unease crawling up her spine. "CRID 104.7, this is Natalie. Who's calling?" The voice crackled through the static, faint and uneven, like a signal struggling to reach through deep water. "You can hear me?" Yeah. "Who is this? You're not coming through on the lines. Are you calling from a cell?" Natalie's eyes darted between the silent phone console and the computer screen, searching for any indication of where the transmission might be coming from. The voice didn't answer her question. Instead, it whispered, the words seeming to slide directly into her brain, bypassing her ears entirely. "Don't let them find me." The static surged suddenly. a wall of white noise that made Natalie cry out in pain. She ripped off her headphones, the plastic clattering against the desk as she pushed back from the control panel. Her heart was racing now, its rhythm matching the pulsing of the static that still leaked from the discarded headphones. Her first instinct was to rationalize. It had to be a prank. Some tech-savvy kid with pirate radio equipment messing with the frequency. But in all her years of late-night radio, she'd never heard interference like this, never encountered a signal that could cut through their broadcast so cleanly. Taking a deep breath, Natalie leaned into the mic, forcing her voice to remain professional, hiding the tremor that threatened to break through. Looks like we're having some technical difficulties tonight, folks. Stay tuned. We'll get back to the music shortly. She queued up a backup playlist from the computer, letting the familiar opening notes of Stairway to Heaven fill the dead air. Standing, she rubbed her temples, trying to massage away the headache that had started building behind her eyes. The station was small, just a single-floor building with a recording booth, a storage closet, and an office. Nowhere for anyone to hide. Nowhere for a signal to originate from within the building itself. Through the studio window, she could see the parking lot, empty except for her blue Honda Civic, bathed in the sickly orange glow of a single street lamp. The static returned without warning, louder than before, making the speakers crackle ominously. Natalie turned toward the soundboard, her eyes widening as she saw small sparks dancing across the metal surface. She reached for the power switch, intent on shutting everything down before the equipment could be damaged. When the voice broke through again, clearer than ever. "Natalie." Her blood ran cold, a chill shooting down her spine at the sound of her name spoken in that otherworldly voice. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" There was a long pause, filled only by the soft hiss of static. Then the voice whispered, each word dripping with dread. "It's not safe." The lights in the studio flickered violently, casting the room in rapid-fire snapshots of darkness that left after-images burning in Natalie's vision. She backed away from the equipment, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone and dialed the station manager, Mark. She knew he would be asleep. It was well past midnight now, but this was beyond her ability to handle alone. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, Mark's cheerful greeting, a jarring contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the studio. "Mark, it's Natalie," she said quickly, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "There's something weird going on at the station. I think someone's messing with the equipment. Call me back as soon as you get this." She hung up and stared at the control panel, which had fallen silent. The static had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Then, in the quiet, she heard something else, a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. Footsteps. Natalie turned toward the studio door, her pulse hammering so loud she could hear it in her ears. The sound was coming from the hallway, slow and deliberate, each step echoing off the linoleum floors with unnatural clarity. The fluorescent lights in the hallway cast long shadows under the door, and in those shadows, she could have sworn she saw movement. She grabbed a metal coffee thermos from the desk, clutching it tightly as a makeshift weapon, the cold steel against her palm providing little comfort. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. In the silence that followed, Natalie could hear her own ragged breathing, too loud in the confined space of the studio. She held the thermos higher, her knuckles white around its circumference, as the doorknob began to rattle. The sound was deliberate, almost curious, like something learning how doors worked for the first time. "Who's there?" she demanded, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "This is private property. I'll call the cops." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, a child's defense against the monsters under the bed. The doorknob stopped moving abruptly, as if startled by her voice. Silence hung in the air for several tense seconds, thick enough to choke on. Then the footsteps retreated, each step slower than the last, fading into the distance like an ebbing tide. Natalie stood frozen, listening intently, counting her heartbeats until she was certain they were gone. Her legs trembling, she made her way back to the control panel, never taking her eyes off the door. With one hand still gripping the thermos, she reached out and locked the studio door, the click of the mechanism oddly loud in the quiet room. The familiar sight of the soundboard, with its well-worn buttons and familiar scratches, provided a momentary anchor to reality. She switched it back on, her fingers moving automatically through the sequence she'd performed countless times before. The hum of electronics returning to life filled the room, a normal sound that should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the purr of some great beast awakening. She flipped through the channels methodically, testing the audio, trying to convince herself that everything was fine, that she'd imagined the whole thing. That's when she heard the recording. It emerged from beneath layers of static like a body rising from deep water, barely audible at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. "Don't let them find me." It was the same voice from before, but different somehow. Older, perhaps, or younger. Impossible to tell. But this time, the static began to distort, twisting and writhing in her headphones until it transformed into something else. A scream that started as human, but ended as something else entirely. Natalie's fingers hovered over the stop button, trembling in the dim light. Some primitive part of her brain screamed at her to press it, to silence the awful sound, but she couldn't move. The scream grew louder, more piercing, containing frequencies that shouldn't have been possible, until it felt like her skull would crack from the pressure. Then it cut off with the suddenness of a severed wire, leaving behind a silence that rang in her ears. Before she could recover, the recording looped, starting again from the beginning, like a broken record playing humanity's last song. With shaking hands, she checked the computer's audio logs, desperate for some rational explanation. But the screen showed nothing. No record of the file, no timestamp, no digital footprint of any kind. It was as though the recording had emerged from some place beyond the reach of technology, a ghostly transmission from a dead frequency. A notification popped up on her screen, the soft blue glow almost gentle in the darkness. Incoming call. Natalie's eyes darted to the phone console, but the lines remained stubbornly dark. No lights, no indication of an incoming call. She looked back at the computer screen, where the notification continued to blink with mechanical persistence, each flash like a heartbeat. Her hand moved toward the mouse as if pulled by an invisible string. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the station and never look back. But something stronger held her in place. The same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down to look at car accidents, that draws moths to flames. With trembling fingers, she clicked to answer. "Natalie." Her breath caught in her throat, a small whimper escaping before she could stop it. The voice was clearer now, as if whatever barrier had separated them was growing thinner. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, the words barely audible even to herself. "They're coming." The lights in the studio died all at once, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Even the emergency lights, which should have kicked in automatically, remained dead. The darkness was complete, absolute, the kind that makes you question whether your eyes are open at all. Natalie fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy with fear, finally managing to activate the flashlight. The dim beam cut through the darkness like a knife, illuminating the cramped space in harsh relief. The shadows it cast seemed too dark, too solid, moving in ways that shadows shouldn't when she wasn't moving the light. The familiar contours of the studio had become alien in the darkness, every corner holding the potential for horror. The sound of footsteps returned, but they were different now, heavier, more numerous, as if multiple sets of feet were moving in perfect unison. They echoed through the hall outside, growing louder with each step, a rhythmic percussion that matched the thunder of her heart. The footsteps stopped again outside the door, and this time, the doorknob twisted with violent force, the whole door shaking in its frame. The lock held, but for how long? Then came a new sound, a faint tapping on the glass of the studio window, like fingernails on a chalkboard. Natalie turned slowly, her flashlight beam trembling as she moved. Outside the window, silhouetted against the wan light of the street lamp, stood a figure. But something was wrong with its proportions. It was too tall, its limbs unnaturally thin and jointed in places where joints shouldn't be. Its face, if it had one, was obscured in shadow, but she could feel it watching her, could sense its hunger seeping through the glass, like cold air through a crack. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, each impact sending spiderweb cracks spreading across the glass. The sound seemed to reach inside her head, setting her teeth on edge and making her bones vibrate with sympathetic frequency. In a moment of pure instinct, Natalie turned off the flashlight, plunging herself into total darkness. The tapping stopped immediately, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. For several eternal seconds, nothing moved. Natalie didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't dare to make a sound. Then the silence was shattered by the sound of breaking glass, a crystalline explosion that sent shards tinkling to the floor like deadly wind chimes. Self-preservation finally overcame paralysis. Natalie bolted for the door, her hands fumbling with the lock before finally wrenching it open. She sprinted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the walls as the building's emergency lights flickered weakly to life, casting strobing shadows that seemed to reach for her as she ran. She burst out into the parking lot, the cool night air hitting her lungs like a shock as she gasped for breath. Her car sat at the far edge of the lot, a blue island in a sea of empty asphalt. She sprinted toward it, her keys jangling in her trembling hand. Behind her, she could hear the faint hum of static growing louder, a sound that shouldn't have been possible outside the studio. She didn't look back, didn't dare to see what might be following. The engine roared to life on the first try, a miracle she would later be thankful for. The tires screeched against the pavement as she accelerated out of the lot, the radio station diminishing in her rearview mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness. As she drove, her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, the screen lighting up the car's interior with a ghostly glow. She glanced at it, her stomach dropping as she saw the notification. It was from the station. A voicemail had been left on the line. With trembling hands, she hit play, knowing she shouldn't but unable to stop herself. "Natalie," the voice said, faint and crackling with static, but unmistakable. "You can't run." The recording cut off, leaving her alone with the sound of her own ragged breathing and the endless dark road ahead. But as she drove through the night, the static on her car radio grew louder, and in its white noise, she could have sworn she heard footsteps. The fluorescent lights in the hospital basement buzzed faintly, their dull glow casting long, uneven shadows across the sterile tiles. The harsh white tubes flickered occasionally, like dying fireflies trapped in glass, creating momentary patches of darkness that seemed to crawl across the walls. Jamie Albright, the night shift technician, stifled a yawn as she pushed her equipment cart toward the maintenance room, its squeaky wheel echoing through the empty corridor. She'd worked plenty of overnight shifts before, but tonight felt heavier somehow, as if the air itself was pressing down on her with an unseen weight, making each breath feel shallow and unsatisfying. The cart's contents rattled softly against the metal frame. Screwdrivers, voltage meters, and various tools that had become familiar companions during her 3 years at St. Michael's Hospital. The basement's peculiar acoustics amplified every small sound, transforming ordinary noises into something almost musical, though discordant. Jamie had grown accustomed to this nocturnal symphony, or so she told herself, even as her eyes instinctively tracked each shifting shadow. The hospital's lockdown drill had started an hour ago, a standard procedure meant to test emergency systems. These drills happen quarterly, but tonight felt different, more intense, more isolating. Jamie wasn't thrilled about being stuck in the basement during the drill, but it beat dealing with panicked patients upstairs. The hospital's labyrinthine lower floors were mostly deserted, just a series of hallways, storage rooms, and boiler chambers that hadn't seen proper renovation since the 1970s. The old blueprints hanging in the security office showed how the basement had grown over decades, with new sections grafted onto old ones like architectural scar tissue. She rolled the cart into the maintenance room, its wheels leaving faint tracks in the thin layer of dust that seemed to accumulate no matter how often the floors were cleaned. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed louder here, an angry electric drone that made her teeth ache. Jamie double-checked the list of items she needed to catalog, her pencil tapping against the clipboard in an unconscious rhythm. Cleaning supplies, spare light bulbs, replacement wiring. It was all routine, mundane tasks that shouldn't have made her pulse quicken every time she ventured into the deeper reaches of the basement. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and old concrete, with an underlying metallic tang that reminded her of blood. Jamie had always hated that smell, though her co-workers insisted they couldn't detect it. The sound of her own breathing echoed faintly in the empty space, accompanied by the steady drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the walls. Drip, 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 like a metronome counting down to something she couldn't quite grasp. The quiet was broken by the intercom, its speaker crackling to life with a burst of static that made her jump. Attention, lockdown procedure is now in effect. All staff, please remain in your designated zones until further notice. The voice was familiar, Bob from security, but something about its tinny quality through the ancient speaker system made it sound almost inhuman. Jamie sighed and muttered to herself, Yeah. Same drill. Different day. Her words seemed to hang in the air, as if the stale basement atmosphere was too thick to let them dissipate properly. She'd been doing this job long enough to know the routine by heart, but something about tonight made every shadow seem deeper, every corner darker. She grabbed a clipboard and started inventorying the shelves, her pen scratching against the paper in the silence. The maintenance room's shelves towered over her, metal racks stretching toward the ceiling like industrial rib cages. A faint scraping sound caught her attention, coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. A dry, deliberate noise that reminded her of fingernails dragging across concrete. She froze, her pen hovering above the clipboard, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello?" she called out, her voice carrying down the hallway, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it sound like someone else was calling back. The scraping stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt expectant, as if the very air was waiting for something to happen. Jamie shook her head, trying to dislodge the creeping unease that had settled at the base of her skull. It was probably one of the older air vents. The hospital's HVAC system was ancient, a maze of ducts and pipes that groaned and whispered throughout the night. This hospital was ancient, and the ventilation system was notorious for its odd noises, sounds that sometimes seemed almost like voices if you listened too closely. She returned to her work, but her focus was fractured, her ears straining for any other sounds beneath the steady hum of electricity and the distant thrum of machinery. A few minutes later, her radio crackled, the sudden burst of static making her hand jerk, leaving a jagged line across her inventory sheet. "Albright, this is security. Can you confirm your location?" The voice was tense, lacking its usual casual tone. Something in the way the words were clipped made her skin prickle. Jamie picked up the device, frowning at the unusual static that seemed to pulse beneath the voice. "Basement level 2. Maintenance room." Why? She tried to keep her voice steady, professional, even as her free hand clenched involuntarily at her side. "We're getting some odd readings on the lockdown panels. Motion sensors are picking up activity near your location. You see anyone else down there?" There was something off about the way the question was asked, as if the guard already knew the answer and was afraid of having it confirmed. Jamie glanced at the empty corridor outside the room, where the shadows seemed to have grown darker, more substantial. "No, just me. What kind of activity?" She found herself speaking more quietly now, as if afraid of being overheard by something lurking in those shadows. The security guard hesitated, dead air filling the channel. When he spoke again, his voice was different, almost strained. "Probably nothing. Just keep your eyes open." The way he emphasized open made it sound like a warning rather than casual advice. The radio went silent, leaving behind a soft hiss of static that seemed to whisper wordlessly. Jamie clipped it back onto her belt and exhaled slowly, watching her breath form a slight fog in the air. Had it gotten colder? It wasn't unusual for the hospital's outdated system to glitch during drills, but something about the guard's tone unsettled her, like he was trying to tell her something without actually saying it. She finished the inventory with mechanical precision, her movements quick and efficient, driven by a growing desire to be anywhere but here. The clipboard's metal clip had grown cold against her fingers, as if the metal itself was drawing heat from her body. She pushed the cart back into the hallway, its wheels squeaking in protest. The air felt colder now, the temperature dropping sharply as she moved toward the elevator, each breath visible in small, frightened puffs. When she pressed the button, nothing happened. The panel remained dark, lifeless, as if the power had been cut. She jabbed it again, harder this time, but the panel remained unlit, reflecting her increasingly worried expression in its brushed metal surface. The silence around her seemed to deepen, as if the very walls were holding their breath. "Perfect," she muttered, her voice sounding small and lost in the corridor. "Of course it decides to break during lockdown." The words came out in a white cloud, the temperature now low enough to make her shiver. She pulled her thin hospital jacket tighter around herself, though it did little to ward off the chill that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. Jamie glanced at the stairwell door across the hall, its metal surface marked with decades of use. She'd have to lug her cart up 2 flights, which was far from ideal, but it wasn't the worst thing in the world. At least, that's what she told herself as she abandoned the cart, its contents casting twisted shadows in the dim light. She opened the stairwell door, the hinges protesting with a sound like a distant scream. She began climbing, her footsteps echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The stairwell had always felt like a separate world, disconnected from the rest of the hospital. But tonight it felt different, wrong somehow, as if the very geometry of the space had shifted when she wasn't looking. She was halfway up when she noticed something strange, something that made her stomach lurch, and her mind rebel against what her eyes were telling her. The stairwell was longer than it should have been, stretching upward in a way that defied the building's known dimensions. By now, she should have reached the first-floor landing, but the steps kept going, stretching endlessly upward into shadows that seemed to move and twist. Jamie stopped and turned around, her heart thundering in her chest. The bottom of the stairwell was no longer visible, swallowed by a darkness that seemed almost liquid in its density. A flicker of panic rose in her chest, sharp and cold, like swallowed ice. "Nope," she said aloud, her voice trembling, the word echoing back to her in ways that suggested the acoustics of the space were no longer following normal physical laws. "This is not happening." The denial felt hollow, even as she spoke it, like trying to reason with a nightmare. She retraced her steps, descending as quickly as she dared on legs that felt increasingly unreliable. The metal stairs rang hollowly beneath her feet, each impact sending vibrations that seemed to travel up through her bones. After what felt like minutes, though her watch insisted only seconds had passed, she pushed through the nearest door, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. It wasn't the basement. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The hallway on the other side was unfamiliar, wrong in ways that were both subtle and profound. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, but the sound had a different quality now, less mechanical and more organic, like the hum of invisible insects. The tiles were scuffed with patterns she didn't recognize, marking out abstract shapes that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The walls were stained with watermarks that looked disturbingly like faces in profile, their features twisted in expressions of silent distress. Jamie's cart was nowhere in sight, though she was certain she'd left it just outside the stairwell. The absence of this familiar anchor to normality made her feel untethered, as if reality itself was beginning to unravel around her. She took a step forward, her sneakers squeaking on the floor in a way that sounded almost like a whimper. The air smelled musty, like mildew and damp concrete, but underneath was something else. An organic decay that reminded her of the morgue during her brief rotation there as a trainee. Glancing back at the stairwell door, she noticed it lacked the hospital's standard labeling, the absence of these familiar markers making it seem alien and threatening. There was no basement level sign, no directional arrows, nothing to orient herself by. Just a plain metal door with a faded number etched into the handle, 03. The number seemed to pulse slightly as she stared at it, though she told herself it was just a trick of the unreliable lighting. Her radio crackled again, the sound making her flinch. Through the static, she heard her name. Jamie. The voice was familiar but distorted, like someone trying to speak underwater. The static seemed to form patterns, almost words that lurked just below the threshold of comprehension. She grabbed it, her fingers shaking so badly she almost dropped the device. "Yeah, I'm here. Where are you guys?" Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, higher and tighter than normal, stripped of its usual professional composure. The response was garbled, the words distorted beyond recognition. Through the electronic noise, she thought she heard her name again, but this time it sounded like a warning. The signal cut out before she could be sure, leaving behind a static that seemed to whisper in voices too quiet to understand. She stared at the radio, debating whether to call back, when a faint sound reached her ears, a sound that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere down the corridor. A measured pace that spoke of purpose rather than wandering. The sound had a peculiar quality to it, as if the feet making the noise weren't quite touching the ground in the normal way. Jamie turned toward the sound, her flashlight beam sweeping the hallway with trembling urgency. It illuminated rows of closed doors, each one identical to the next, their surfaces marked with numbers that seemed to rearrange themselves when she wasn't looking directly at them. "Hello?" she called out, immediately regretting the sound of her voice in this space. Her words echoed back to her, but the echo was wrong. It came too late, and the tone was different, almost mocking. The footsteps continued, growing louder, more insistent. They were too rhythmic to belong to a patient or a staff member, too steady, too purposeful. Each impact seemed to resonate at a frequency that made her teeth ache. Jamie backed away, her flashlight trembling in her grip, the beam catching dust motes that moved against the air currents in impossible ways. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking on the last word. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but not unacknowledged. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt alive, anticipatory. The absence of sound was worse than the footsteps had been. At least with the footsteps, she knew which direction to fear. Jamie turned and ran. She darted down the corridor, her sneakers slipping on the damp floor that shouldn't have been wet. The hall seemed to stretch on forever, each door identical to the last, though she could have sworn some of the numbers were counting backward. Her lungs burned with each breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She finally reached an intersection and paused to catch her breath, her chest heaving as she tried to orient herself in this impossible space. The hall split into two directions, each one disappearing into a distance that seemed to bend slightly at the edges of her vision, as if reality itself was warping. A faint hum filled the air, like machinery running far below, but it wasn't the familiar sound of hospital equipment. This noise had a pulse to it, a rhythm that seemed almost biological, like the breathing of something vast and ancient. A door creaked open behind her. The sound was deliberate, almost performative, like something was announcing its presence. Jamie spun around, her flashlight cutting through the shadows that seemed to recoil from the beam. One of the doors she'd passed moments ago now stood ajar, though she was certain it had been sealed when she ran past it. Beyond the doorway, she could see nothing but darkness. Not the ordinary darkness of an unlit room, but something deeper, something that seemed to swallow her flashlight's beam entirely. Her radio crackled again, the static rising and falling like waves. This time, the voice was clearer, though she almost wished it wasn't. "Jamie, you need to leave. Now." The words were precise, carefully enunciated. But it wasn't the security guard's voice. It wasn't any voice she recognized, and yet somehow it knew her name. There was something wrong with its cadence, as if whoever, or whatever, was speaking had learned human speech by observation rather than experience. Jamie's pulse raced, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her ears. "Who is this? What's going on?" Her words echoed strangely, coming back to her distorted, like they'd traveled through somewhere else before returning. The voice didn't respond. The radio went silent, but the hum in the air grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made her vision blur at the edges. Jamie turned back to the intersection, choosing the left hallway at random, though some part of her wondered if either choice really mattered anymore. She sprinted forward, desperate to find an exit, a stairwell, anything that might lead back to the normal world she'd left behind. As she ran, The walls around her began to change, the transformation subtle at first, but increasingly dramatic. The tiles faded into cracked concrete, the smooth surface giving way to rough texture that seemed to pulse slightly under her peripheral vision. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, their rhythm matching the arrhythmic pounding of her heart. The hum deepened into a low, pulsing sound that seemed to resonate in her bones, making her teeth chatter and her vision swim. Ahead of her, a figure appeared. It manifested gradually, like a photograph developing in reverse. It was barely more than a shadow at first, its outline flickering like static on an old television screen. It stood motionless in the center of the hallway, its head tilted at an angle that suggested a complete disregard for human anatomy. The figure's edges seemed to blur and shift, as if it wasn't entirely committed to maintaining a solid form. Jamie froze, her flashlight beam falling short of the figure's obscured features, as if the light itself was afraid to reveal too much. "Stay back," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. The air around the figure seemed to darken, shadows gathering like curious spectators. The figure didn't move, but something about its stillness suggested anticipation rather than hesitation. Then, with a sudden burst of motion that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself, it lunged forward. The movement was wrong, too fluid, too fast, like a film played at double speed. The air around it rippled like heat waves off hot asphalt, distorting the space it passed through. Jamie screamed and bolted in the opposite direction, her voice bouncing off the walls in fragments that sounded like laughter. She didn't dare look back, her feet pounding against the floor as the pulsing hum filled her ears, drowning out everything except her own terrified heartbeat. The corridor seemed to twist and bend around her as she ran, the walls breathing in and out like the sides of a massive throat. She reached another stairwell door and shoved it open with enough force to make the hinges shriek in protest. This time, the stairwell looked normal, almost ostentatiously so, as if it was trying too hard to appear ordinary. The familiar hospital signage marked each landing, though Jamie could have sworn some of the letters rearranged themselves when she wasn't looking directly at them. She scrambled up the steps, her breath hitching with every movement, the sound of her footsteps echoing back to her slightly out of sync. When she reached the ground floor, she burst through the door and into the brightly lit lobby with its reassuring fluorescent lights and familiar antiseptic smell. The receptionist looked up from her desk, startled by Jamie's explosive entrance. "Jamie, are you okay?" The receptionist's voice was normal, concerned, anchored in the everyday world of paperwork and visiting hours. The mundane reality of the lobby, the squeaking of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the distant beeping of medical equipment, the murmur of normal hospital activity, felt almost surreal after what she'd experienced. Jamie didn't answer immediately. She doubled over, gasping for air, her hands trembling as they gripped her knees. She glanced back at the stairwell door, half expecting the shadow to materialize, to prove that she hadn't imagined everything. The door remained closed, solid and ordinary, though she noticed the number plate on it was slightly crooked, as if it had been recently disturbed. The lockdown drill ended 10 minutes later, announced by the same calm voice that had started it, though Jamie found herself analyzing every word for hidden meanings or distortions. She filed a report about the stairwell malfunction and the strange hallways, trying to describe her experience in the clinical language of incident reports and maintenance logs. But no one seemed to take her seriously. They nodded and made notes, but their eyes held the patronizing skepticism reserved for overtired staff working too many night shifts. Security reviewed the basement footage and claimed there were no anomalies, though Jamie noticed they didn't offer to show her the actual recordings. But Jamie knew what she saw. The experience had carved itself into her memory with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, leaving behind wounds that wouldn't quite heal. The next night, she called in sick, her voice steady as she made up an excuse about food poisoning. When she checked the hospital's blueprints online, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. The basement levels she'd entered had been sealed off years ago, marked as structurally unsound after a series of unexplained incidents in the 1970s. Whatever was down there, it wasn't part of the hospital anymore. And as she sat in her apartment, listening to the hum of normal appliances and trying to convince herself that they sounded nothing like that other hum, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her home. Something that was waiting in the shadows, watching with patience accumulated over countless years, its head tilted at that impossible angle. Every now and then, her radio crackles with static, even when it's turned off. The tech firm's sprawling office building cast long shadows across the empty parking lot, its glass facade reflecting the sickly orange glow of sodium vapor lamps. Eric Green, the night shift IT technician, clicked his pen nervously as he reviewed his work order for the third time that evening, a habit he'd developed during his 2 years of solitary night shifts. Most of his job involved mundane tasks, basic maintenance, updating security software, or troubleshooting minor issues that harried employees reported during their daytime hours. The monotony usually brought comfort, a predictable rhythm to his nights. But tonight felt different. The air hung heavy with an inexplicable tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His work order glowed on the monitor before him, the text seeming to pulse in the artificial light. Investigate a persistent alert from room 300. The issue had been flagged multiple times over the past week, an anomaly in the door's security system that kept triggering silent alarms in the building's network. The problem wasn't the alert itself. It was that no one had ever heard of room 300. Eric leaned back in his chair, the worn leather creaking in protest as he stared at the firm's floor plan displayed on his laptop. His eyes burned from the screen's harsh brightness, the only substantial light source in his basement office. The architectural drawings were precise, clinical in their detail. Every room, every closet, every emergency exit carefully labeled and accounted for. But there was no mention of room 300. The building's numbering system made an inexplicable jump from 299 to 301, with no apparent space for the missing room. Logic suggested it was simply a system glitch, an outdated label in the software perhaps, or a coding error in the security system's database. Still, protocol was protocol, and Eric took pride in his thoroughness. He grabbed his toolkit, its familiar weight offering little comfort tonight, and headed out into the dimly lit hallways. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, its steady drone punctuated by the occasional metallic ping of settling ductwork. The faint scent of industrial cleaning supplies lingered in the air, bleach and artificial lemon fighting a losing battle against the perpetual mustiness of the building's lower levels. The building was practically empty, save for a few janitors working on the lower floors, their distant footsteps and the occasional rattle of cleaning carts echoing through the vast space. The elevator ride to the third floor seemed longer than usual, each floor passing with a subtle shift in air pressure that made his ears pop. Eric watched the numbers illuminate sequentially. 1, 2, 3. The doors opened with a soft chime that seemed oddly intrusive in the silence. His footsteps echoed down the vacant corridors as he began his search, the sound bouncing off the sterile walls in a way that made it difficult to tell if he was hearing his own movements or something else. Most of the doors on this floor were labeled with sleek modern plaques, their brushed aluminum surfaces bearing laser-engraved text. Conference Room 301, Storage 299, Development Lab 303. The uniformity of their design made them blend together, creating an almost hypnotic pattern as Eric moved down the hallway. But as he turned the corner, something caught his eye that broke the monotony so jarringly it made him stop mid-stride. Halfway down the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar, something that violated every security protocol the firm had in place. Its plaque read 300, but the numbers were etched into the metal in a font that didn't match the others. The edges of the characters slightly rough, as if they had been carved by hand rather than machine. The door itself was an anomaly, made of heavy dark wood rather than the glass or brushed steel that characterized the rest of the floor. The wood appeared aged, its surface marked with subtle scratches and wear patterns that suggested years of use. Impossible, given that the building was barely 5 years old. Eric's pulse quickened as he approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew noticeably cooler, and he could swear the fluorescent lights dimmed slightly, though he told himself it was just his imagination. He nudged the door open with his foot, revealing a darkened room beyond. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness like a knife, illuminating particles of dust that seemed to hang motionless in the air, defying the building's sophisticated ventilation system. The room that stretched before him was a stark contradiction to everything he knew about the building. Rows of desks lined the space, each covered in old, outdated computers that looked like relics from the early 2000s. Stacks of yellowed paper sat in precarious piles, their edges curled with age. The furniture was mismatched and weathered. Metal desks with chipped paint, chairs with torn upholstery, ancient filing cabinets with drawers slightly ajar. It looked like a snapshot from a different era, preserved in dust and shadows. Eric stepped inside cautiously, his shoes crunching on debris scattered across the floor, broken pencils, paper clips, fragments of what might have been a coffee mug. A faint buzzing sound emanated from somewhere in the room, low and rhythmic, like the hum of old fluorescent tubes, but somehow more purposeful. The sound seemed to resonate in his chest, making his heart beat in an uncomfortable syncopation. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding muffled and wrong in the stale air. He half hoped no one would answer, yet the complete silence that followed his call was somehow worse than any response might have been. The room seemed to absorb his words, swallowing them into its mysterious depths. At the far end of the room, an old CRT monitor suddenly flickered to life, its screen casting a sickly green glow that seemed to push back against his flashlight beam. Eric jumped, nearly dropping his flashlight, his heart leaping into his throat. The monitor displayed a simple blinking cursor against a black screen, its steady pulse reminiscent of a heartbeat. Then, with agonizing slowness, text began to appear, each character materializing with a faint electronic chirp. "Eric Green, sit down." A chill ran down his spine, and goosebumps erupted across his arms. He glanced around the room, certain someone was playing an elaborate prank. Perhaps some bored programmer with too much time on their hands. But the door remained ajar exactly as he'd left it, the hallway beyond empty and silent. He turned back to the monitor, where the cursor continued its steady blink beneath his name, patient and somehow expectant. "Very funny," Eric muttered, taking a tentative step closer. His voice sounded thin and unconvincing, even to his own ears. "Who's behind this?" The monitor's text updated instantly, the green characters appearing all at once with a sharp electronic crack that made him flinch. "No one you know. Sit down." Eric's heart pounded against his ribs, each beat seeming to echo the monitor's pulsing cursor. Against every instinct screaming at him to run, he pulled out a chair and sat in front of the terminal. The chair's ancient cushion compressed with a puff of dust, and something in its frame creaked ominously. The keyboard before him was a relic, its keys worn to illegibility. The beige plastic yellowed with age. He reached for the power button, desperate to end whatever this was, but the monitor flashed a new message before his fingers could make contact. Don't. You need to see this. The buzzing in the room grew louder, more insistent, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Eric's fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly in the green glow. After a moment's hesitation, he typed cautiously, "What do you want?" The reply was immediate, the characters appearing with such speed they seemed to blur. "To show you the truth." Before Eric could process what that might mean, the monitor flickered violently, its screen filled with static, before resolving into a grainy video feed. The footage was black and white, the kind of quality he associated with security cameras from decades past. It showed a man sitting at a desk in a modern office, working intently at a computer. The man's posture, his haircut, the way he absently adjusted his glasses, everything about him was hauntingly familiar. Eric leaned closer, his nose almost touching the screen, though some part of him wanted to recoil from what he was seeing. The man was him. The timestamp in the corner showed a date from 5 years earlier, just after the building had opened. Eric watched, transfixed, as his past self worked at a desk that looked nothing like the antiques surrounding him now. The office in the video was sleek and modern, matching the firm's current aesthetic perfectly. But something was wrong. Terribly, fundamentally wrong. In the corner of the video, a shadow began to flicker. At first, Eric thought it was an artifact of the poor video quality, a glitch in the ancient system. But the shadow grew darker, more defined, taking on depth and dimension until it formed the unmistakable shape of a person standing just behind his past self. Eric's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the figure slowly raise an arm, its movement jerky and unnatural, and place a hand on his shoulder. The Eric in the video showed no reaction, continuing to type as if nothing was wrong. The screen went black with a sharp crack of static. Eric spun around so fast the chair nearly tipped over, his flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the room. There was nothing there, just the same rows of desks and outdated equipment, shadows shifting in the erratic light. The buzzing sound had faded to almost nothing, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by his ragged breathing and the thunder of his pulse in his ears. The monitor lit up again, its green glow somehow harsher than before. The message appeared one letter at a time, each character accompanied by a sound like breaking glass. "You don't belong here." Eric stood so quickly the chair fell backward with a crash that seemed to shake the entire room. His breath came in shallow gasps as he backed toward the door, his flashlight beam trembling violently. "I'm done playing games," he said aloud, his voice cracking with fear he could no longer disguise. As he reached the threshold, the monitor displayed one final message, the text seeming to burn itself into both the screen and his mind. "Don't come back." Eric slammed the door shut with enough force to rattle the walls and bolted down the hallway, his footsteps echoing chaotically off the walls. The distance to the elevator seemed to have doubled, the corridor stretching impossibly long before him. When he finally reached the elevator, he punched the button repeatedly, his finger aching from the force. He glanced over his shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see something pursuing him down the hallway. But the corridor remained empty, though the sense of being watched pressed down on him like a physical weight. The elevator's arrival chime made him jump, and he practically dove inside, jamming the button for the ground floor with trembling fingers. As the doors began to slide shut, he heard it. Faint footsteps echoing down the hall, accompanied by that same low rhythmic buzzing. Back in the security office, Eric pulled up the building's digital floor plan again, his hands still shaking as he navigated through the files. Room 300 was gone, as if it had never existed. The records showed no trace of it, no hint that anything lay between rooms 299 and 301. He searched through years of architectural drawings, security logs, and maintenance records, finding nothing. With unsteady fingers, he logged the incident as a minor anomaly and filed a work order for further investigation, though he knew deep down that no one would ever find anything. When his manager reviewed the report the next morning, there was nothing there. No log, no timestamps, no digital breadcrumbs to prove that Eric had ever set foot on the third floor that night. Eric didn't stay at the firm much longer. Something about that room, its impossible existence, its cryptic warnings, the way it seemed to exist in a fold of reality where past and present bled together, haunted him. He found himself taking the stairs rather than the elevator, avoiding the third floor entirely. At night, he would wake in a cold sweat. The image of that shadowy figure burned into his mind. Years later, he occasionally dreamed of room 300. In his dreams, the monitors always flickered with green text, and that low buzzing sound filled the air. Sometimes he saw himself sitting at those ancient desks, typing endlessly while shadows gathered behind him. But he never went back to verify if the room still existed, if it had ever really existed at all. The warning stayed with him, echoing in his thoughts, whenever his mind wandered too close to that night. Don't come back. And he never did. The gas station on Route 47 was quiet, as it always was during the graveyard shift. Noah sat behind the scratched laminate counter, flipping through a battered paperback novel, some generic thriller he'd picked up from the discount rack at the local bookstore. The pages were dog-eared and coffee-stained, much like everything else in the store. Outside, the fluorescent lights of the pump stations buzzed softly, casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt, their harsh glow creating wavering patterns that danced across the empty parking lot like restless spirits. The store itself was a testament to late-night monotony. Rows of perfectly aligned snack bags, their bright packaging dulled by the flickering overhead lights, coolers humming their constant mechanical lullaby, and the coffee pot in the corner, maintaining its endless vigil over burnt dregs that hadn't been replaced since the evening shift. The air smelled of stale coffee and pine-scented cleaner, a combination that had become as familiar to Noah as his own bedroom. It wasn't an exciting job, but it paid well enough, and the isolation didn't bother Noah. He'd always been comfortable with solitude, preferring the quiet companionship of books to the chaos of daylight hours. Most nights passed uneventfully, punctuated by the occasional trucker or night owl stopping for gas or snacks. The routine had become almost meditative. Check the pumps, straighten the merchandise, read a few chapters, repeat. Tonight seemed no different, until the clock on the wall caught his attention. It was 2:59 a.m. The red digital display cast a bloody glow across the counter, its numbers seeming to pulse in the fluorescent light. Noah frowned, his paperback forgotten in his lap. He could have sworn it had been closer to 3:10 just a moment ago. The certainty of it nagged at him, like an itch he couldn't quite reach. He glanced at his phone, its screen illuminating his face with a harsh blue glow. The screen also read 2:59 a.m. "That's weird," he muttered, his voice sounding unusually loud in the empty store. The words seemed to hang in the air, absorbed by the rows of merchandise that stood like silent sentinels. A minute later, the clock ticked forward to 3:00 a.m., and the moment passed. Noah shrugged it off as fatigue, the kind that comes from too many consecutive night shifts and too little proper sleep. He returned to his book, though the words seemed to swim on the page, refusing to form coherent sentences. An hour later, the door chimed its electronic greeting as a customer entered, bringing with her a gust of cool night air that stirred the dust motes floating in the fluorescent light. Noah looked up to see a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a navy windbreaker that seemed to absorb the harsh store lighting. She had tired eyes, the kind that spoke of long miles and longer thoughts, and a polite smile that didn't quite reach them. Her movements were practiced and efficient as she grabbed a coffee and a pack of gum before approaching the counter, her shoes making soft, squeaking sounds against the linoleum floor. "Busy night?" she asked as Noah rang her up, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd been driving too long without speaking. "Not really. Same as usual," he replied, his fingers moving automatically over the register keys. The familiar beeps seemed somehow muted, as if coming from underwater. "Just passing through?" She nodded, her movements almost too smooth, too controlled. Heading back home after visiting family. Long drive. She handed him a $10 bill, the paper feeling oddly warm against his skin. "Keep the change." "Thanks. Have a good one." The words felt mechanical in his mouth, part of the script he'd performed countless times before. The woman left, the door chime marking her departure like a bell tolling in an empty church. Noah settled back into his chair, the vinyl creaking beneath his weight. He glanced at the clock, more out of habit than conscious thought. 3:30 a.m. His brow furrowed, the skin between his eyebrows pulling tight. That wasn't right. He'd just rung up the woman, and it had to be closer to 3:05 by now. The entire transaction, her entrance, the coffee, the gum, the conversation, had taken at least 5 minutes. He checked his phone, the screen reflecting in his widened eyes. It, too, displayed 3:00 a.m. Noah felt a faint unease creep into his chest, like cold fingers wrapping around his ribs. The clock ticked forward again, and the moment passed, but the sensation lingered, a shadow at the edge of his consciousness. He shook his head, dismissing it as sleep deprivation, and decided to grab a cup of coffee for himself. The pot was still warm, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd made a fresh batch. The rest of the shift crawled by with the reluctance of a condemned man approaching the gallows. When his replacement, Kyle, arrived at 6 a.m., his familiar face a welcome intrusion into the night's strangeness. Noah mentioned the oddity about the clocks. The fluorescent lights seemed to brighten at Kyle's arrival, as if relieved by the presence of another witness. Kyle laughed, the sound echoing off the glass cooler doors. "Man, you've got too much time to think on this shift. Maybe we should set up a chessboard back here or something. Give you something to focus on besides watching the clock." Noah grinned, but the unease lingered like a bad aftertaste as he drove home, his headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Something about the way the clocks had aligned felt off. Wrong in a way he couldn't articulate, like a word caught on the tip of his tongue. The next night, the oddity returned with the persistence of a recurring nightmare. It started the same way, a quiet shift with the occasional customer, the hum of the overhead lights, creating a white noise that seemed to fill every corner of the store, and the monotony of restocking shelves that never seemed to stay full. At exactly 2:59 a.m., Noah felt the same strange sensation, like the air around him had thickened into something almost tangible. The clock paused for what felt like an eternity, its red numbers burning into his retinas like a brand. When it ticked forward to 3:00 a.m., everything felt wrong, as if reality itself had shifted slightly out of alignment. A man entered the store, his steps heavy and deliberate against the linoleum. The door chime seemed muffled, as if struggling to pierce the thick air. He was tall, with a scruffy beard that looked more like shadows than hair, and a jacket that looked 2 sizes too big, hanging off his frame like empty skin. He didn't browse or hesitate. He walked straight to the counter with the inevitability of a freight train, his movements too smooth, too purposeful. He placed a candy bar and a soda down on the counter with precise movements, each item making a sound that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. Noah scanned the items, his unease growing with each beep of the register. The sound seemed to echo strangely, as if coming from much further away than the machine in front of him. "That'll be $2.75. The man handed over exact change without a word, his face blank and emotionless, like a mask carved from flesh. The coins felt unnaturally cold against Noah's palm. As Noah handed back the receipt, the man's eyes flicked to the clock, the movement sharp and bird-like. 3, the man muttered under his breath, his voice low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. "Always 3. "What was that?" Noah asked, the words escaping before he could stop them. His voice sounded thin and reedy in comparison to the man's bass rumble. The man didn't respond. He picked up his items with those same mechanical movements, his joints moving at angles that seemed slightly wrong, and walked out. His steps were stiff and unnatural, as if he'd forgotten how legs were supposed to work. Noah watched him leave, his heart pounding against his ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. The man's truck roared to life in the parking lot, the sound distorted and too deep, its taillights disappearing into the darkness like dying stars. Noah checked the clock again, his neck muscles protesting the movement. It hadn't moved. It still read 3 a.m., the numbers seeming to pulse with an inner light that had nothing to do with electricity. He stared at it, willing it to tick forward. The seconds stretched into minutes, each moment feeling like an eternity, compressed into a single breath. The room felt heavier, almost suffocating, as if the air itself had gained weight. He checked his phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The battery seemingly drained despite being fully charged moments before. The lights flickered overhead, their buzz transforming into something that sounded almost like words spoken just below the threshold of understanding. The faint hum of static filled the room, growing louder with each passing second that wasn't actually passing. Noah felt a chill crawl up his spine, each vertebra registering the sensation individually, like icy fingers playing a xylophone made of bone. The clock finally moved, ticking to 3:01 a.m. with an audible click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The tension eased slightly, but the unease remained, settling into his bones like a winter chill. Something was wrong with that hour, but Noah couldn't put his finger on it. It was like trying to remember a dream that dissolved upon waking, leaving only the aftertaste of terror. The next night, he decided to record what happened. He set up his phone on the counter, propping it up against the cash register. The screen reflected the fluorescent lights, creating a mirror that showed only darkness where his face should be. As 2:59 a.m. approached, he hit record and waited, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the counter. The clock ticked forward, and the shift began. Noah felt the same oppressive weight in the air, the faint static buzz growing louder, until it seemed to fill his skull. The door chimed, the sound distorted and stretched, and a woman entered. She looked vaguely familiar. Mid-40s, navy windbreaker that seemed to absorb light. She grabbed a coffee and a pack of gum before approaching the counter, her movements a perfect recreation of a scene he'd already witnessed. "Busy night?" she asked, her tone identical to the night before, down to the last inflection. Noah froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. It was the same woman. He stared at her, his heart racing so fast he thought it might burst. Didn't you come in last night?" The woman tilted her head, the movement too smooth, like a doll being manipulated by unseen hands. Her expression of confusion seemed painted on, a perfect mask of bewilderment. "No, this is my first stop here. Long drive." She handed him a $10 bill, just like before, the paper still unnaturally warm. "Keep the change." Noah's hands trembled as he took the bill, the numbers on it seeming to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. The woman smiled politely and left, just as she had the night before, her footsteps making no sound on the linoleum. Noah grabbed his phone, stopping the recording with shaking fingers. When he replayed the footage, the screen showed only static, a writhing mass of black and white pixels that seemed to move with purpose, forming shapes that disappeared the moment he tried to focus on them. No image of the woman, no sound, just static that seemed to whisper just below the threshold of hearing. He sat there for the rest of his shift, gripping the counter and watching the clock. Each tick felt heavier, more deliberate, as if time itself was straining under some unseen force. The fluorescent lights continued their endless buzz, but now the sound seemed to carry meaning, like a conversation in another room, just too quiet to make out. The following morning, Noah reported the incidents to his manager, who listened with a skeptical smile that never reached his eyes. The office seemed too bright, too normal after the strangeness of the night shift. "You're overthinking it," the manager said, shuffling papers on his desk without looking at them. "You've been working too many night shifts. Take a day off. Clear your head." But Noah knew it wasn't exhaustion. Something was wrong with that hour, and it was happening every night, as regular as a heartbeat in a chest that shouldn't be beating. Determined to find answers, he stayed late after his next shift, reviewing the station's security footage. The cameras captured every minute of the night, except for 3:01 to 4:09 a.m. The recording skipped over that hour entirely, jumping from 2:59 to 4:01 without explanation, as if that hour had been surgically removed from time itself. He checked the logs, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through the timestamps. The system listed the missing hour as corrupted, the text itself seeming to blur and shift as he tried to read it. Noah leaned back in his chair, his skin crawling with the sensation of unseen eyes watching him. He thought about the customers, the man with the candy bar, the woman with the coffee. Were they real? Or were they part of whatever was happening during that hour? Actors in a play that repeated night after night, wearing faces that looked almost but not quite human. That night, as 2:59 approached, Noah braced himself, his knuckles white on the edge of the counter. The air grew heavy again, pressing against his skin like a physical presence. The lights flickered, their buzz taking on that almost language quality that made his teeth ache. The door chimed, but this time, no one entered. Instead, the static buzzed louder, filling the room like a living thing. Noah gripped the counter, his knuckles white, watching as shadows moved against the laws of physics, stretching and contracting in ways that hurt his eyes to witness. The clock ticked to 3:01, and the air lightened suddenly, like a weight being lifted. The static faded, leaving Noah in a silence so profound it felt deafening, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. He never worked the night shift again. But sometimes, when he drove past the gas station late at night, he glanced at the clock in his car, and every so often, for a fleeting moment, it read 3:00 a.m., and the world would hold its breath, waiting for something that lurked in that missing hour, something that walked with two smooth movements and spoke with voices that sounded almost, but not quite, human. And time seemed to stand still, frozen in that eternal moment when the veil between what should be and what is grows thin enough to tear.